This is part two of our lecture of understanding culture, identifying what culture is. And if you were to see this collection of people, summertime is almost over, the last chance at a water park, how likely would you be to want to join this particular time at the water park? Or ride on a train, taking a ride to get somewhere. One thing that we know about culture is the idea of social proximity and space. The idea that each culture has its own idea of what is too close and what is comfortable when it comes to social norms and social space. This particular diagram is a typical social space and personal space and public space for people in culture in the United States. Other cultures, they may be completely different. There are some where people stand closer together when they interact with you on a social level. There are others, places where people may stand farther apart. For example, in a country like Germany, where people tend to stand at a very far distance from one another when interacting, which would seem strange for people who come from cultures where people get very close in order to interact. But the idea of how close or what's too close varies by culture. We also know that our cultural habits and perceptions and inventions also mold human nature. For example, this is a public toilet that can be found in some European countries, and the glass that is there, when a person enters it, it fills up with a gas, a liquid gas, and you're unable to see in while the person is inside, but the person can see out. How many of you would take advantage of something like this? But even something like elimination is shaped by cultural traditions and customs. You may go to another country where the facility is simply a hole in the ground, and people oftentimes experience culture shock when traveling to other countries and having to do things such as eliminate. Culture is also integrated. There was a group of people that were known as the Yir, who this story was told about still access for Stone Age Australians. In the beginning times, the men in the group of the Yir were the ones who controlled the stone axes. They were used for a variety of things in their culture. They constantly were using them. The men controlled who had access to them. You had to go to the men for permission to use them. And one day the Yir started trading with some outsiders who, when they saw the stone axes, they decided that they could provide steel axes, and they made an agreement with the Yir. They would supply them with the steel axes. But the problem came in is that they made the axes available to everyone, regardless of age, regardless of gender. And one simple act, an introduction of a steel axe, made a tremendous difference in Yir society and very much came close to ruining the society because of the fact that now you disrupted their entire way of being, their entire way of doing with one simple item, a steel axe. But because culture is integrated, have to be careful oftentimes when it comes to introducing new ideas and new objects and new ways of being into a particular culture because of the effect that it can have because of the integration of culture. Culture also has adaptive and maladaptive dimensions. This is a picture of a water bottle that long ago the decision was made by some manufacturers and other people that it would be convenient if people had access to bottles of water. They were able to carry the water around. No longer would you be confined to getting water from a water fountain or other place like that, but now you could carry it in your backpack, you could carry it in your hand, in your purse, and have it in many places where water was inconvenient. That's part of the adaptive dimension of culture, being able to do things that seem beneficial, but some of the long-term harm that also can come about by the same thing, all of a sudden you're confronted with millions and upon millions of bottles of discarded plastic water bottles, and what are you going to do with those things? And it's become a really big problem and a really difficult solution to find an answer to. So sometimes things that in the short term can be beneficial, in the long term they might turn out to be harmful. In anthropology, we identify universals. Those are behaviors that we can find cross-culturally that appear in just about every culture that we've been able to determine. There are a number of them, including biological universals, one being a long period of infant dependency. We know that babies, when they're born, spend a great deal of time being dependent upon their parents and their families to help them do things such as learn to read and to talk and to walk, all of those things, versus among many animal species, when the baby is born, that shortly thereafter, in the case of a horse, for example, they're able to get up and to walk and run very shortly after birth. We also know there's year-round sexuality, where among humans that sexual activity is something that we're able to do, unlike you think about your cat or your dog, where they have periods of heat or estrus, where they are then engaged in activity for the purpose of procreation. We also know that because of our complex brains, we're able to communicate in symbols, to create languages, to develop tools. Psychological universals include common ways of thinking, feeling, and processing information. When we talk about feelings, feelings like sadness, grief, happiness, joy are all common feelings that we find universal. When it comes to social universals, living in groups, we think about families that are formed, we think about things like food sharing, all of those are cultural universals, are social universals. And finally, cultural universals, things such as exogamy, which is seeking a mate or a spouse outside of one's immediate group, the incest taboo, and religion are all ways in which we find cultural universals. There are also cultural generalities, and when we talk about those things, and cultural generalities are between cultural universals and the uniqueness or particularities that we will talk about in a moment. But cultural generalities, they occur at different times and places, but they're not in all cultures. They're found in some cultures. And they come about usually because of borrowing or because of domination by a particular culture over another, or through independent invention. And then there are cultural particularities, and that's things that are not generalized or widespread that you find in a single place, in a single culture or society. But they are becoming less common because of the global society in which we live, and ideas and habits and beliefs and all of those things continue to spread as we have more contact with one another because of technology and because of other ways which we now have that we can communicate with other groups of people, and because we are people who ultimately borrow from one another, borrow ideas and many other things that we borrow from one another, that cultural particularities are becoming less and less common.